Let me welcome you all on behalf of the Department of Economics to the annual, or mostly annual, Hicks lecture, which I had a look back through the list of previous Hicks lecture speakers, and it is a who's who of world-renowned economists, people like Solow, Duflo, Acemoglu, Modigliani, Becker, Finkelstein, Blanchard, Rogoff, and today we welcome Danny Quah. So I'm going to very briefly introduce Danny. I'm sure Danny is known to all of you. The interesting thing about Danny is that he is possibly known to all of you for different specific contributions, which is a mark of his wide scholarship. So Danny is currently the Lee Ka-shing Professor and Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at NUS in Singapore. If you come from a background like I do of macroeconomics, you will have first encountered Danny's name when learning about long-run restrictions in structural vector autoregressions in a famous paper with Olivier Blanchard. But you could have also come across him for his work on growth convergence, something, his papers you can start teaching basically from first year, because I think every first year macro course teaches Solow model and prediction of convergence, and Danny has contributed a lot to thinking about that. And some of you may have just come across him because of a 2011, I think nowadays it would be called a GIF, which was this mapping of the world's economic center of gravity, which, much like Danny's career, started somewhere between the US and the UK and has gradually shifted toward Asia. But I'll say a few things about Danny's background, some of which you will know, some of which you will not. Danny was born in Malaysia, studied at Princeton and then Harvard, and then took up an assistant professorship at MIT, then moved to the LSE, where he spent a number of years, including teaching me MSc Macro, which is, I'm sure, something that wasn't big in his career history, but was important in my own. And then I think I wrote the exact date down. After being head of department, he moved to be the inaugural director of the Saw-Suisse Hock Southeast Asia Center at LSE, and then in 2016 moved to Singapore to the Lee Kuan Yew School and gradually moved up to vice dean and then now dean of the school. So Danny is going to tell us about inequality is no sufficient statistic, so we're looking forward to that. But I said I would tell you something you may or may not know about Danny. When I was at LSE, Danny was famous for being a third Dan black belt in Taekwondo and would regularly take part in student events where he would do spinning back kick. I apologize for killing the official term, spinning back kicks and breaking wood held by other Taekwondo experts. And if anybody really wants to know, if you go through YouTube, you can actually still find these videos. But I assume he'll take questions at the end in a much more friendly manner. So without further ado, let me introduce Professor Danny Quah.
Thank you, Michael, for that very kind introduction. You're far too generous to me, and thank you all for sharing this 1 hour this evening with me. I wanted to talk about inequality, as the subject says. But as Michael has suggested, I've been in the profession for quite a while, and I am old school. So let me say what I mean by old school. When new PhDs in economics come to the Lee Kuan Yew School or elsewhere, they give their job market papers. And their job market papers are usually 95-page behemoths with wonderful tables, graphs. There are about 75 different conclusions. There's a 200-page technical appendix. It is an amazing thing that economics PhDs now do. This talk is the anti-economics job market talk. I have one idea I have one empirical finding. I have one conclusion. That's it. I am single-minded in that way. But the single-mindedness that I want to try and get us through is this conclusion, that inequality is no sufficient statistic. All of us here have some exposure to statistics, and we know that sufficient statistics means something very precise in that discipline. But sufficient statistic in ordinary people language also means something that's close to what sufficient statistic means in technical statistics. And that's the idea that you can look at it and learn what you want to about the problem at hand. Often the problem at hand in my line of work now is public policy. What do we do about social cohesion? What do we do about taking care of the weak and vulnerable in society? What do we do about keeping the fabric of society together? Often when we think about inequality, when it comes to, for instance, the history of globalization over the last few decades, we know, you and I know, that in the United States, for instance, part of the pushback on globalization is the idea that it has worsened income inequality. And there are many social observers who put the blame on income inequality as the driver for many, many things that are happening. There are those, Ragurajan among others, who say that income inequality in America drove the policies of the Bill Clinton White House on housing, that led to a wave of cheap housing loans that then led to the US housing mortgage crisis in 2007 that in turn fed into the 2008 global financial crisis. There are many, many such stories that you and I tell each other now, that I'm going to go through in a minute, about why inequality is so important. So what I'm here today, this time, what I'm here standing before you to try and do is to tell you, hold on a bit. Many of the things, many of the causal chains that we draw on social cohesion, globalization, immiserisation of the poor, and we set that against what's happened in income inequality. This subject that's been looked at by Thomas Piketty with his tabulation of what's happened to the 1% in the world, looked at in wave after wave of Gini coefficient studies everywhere, in wave after wave of cross-country growth regressions where inequality appears and is damaging for growth. I want to stand up here and tell you that no, I want you to rethink what it is that we're doing with globalization, with inequality in the story that we tell now. Because mine is a very simple story, I don't have 75 pages of tables to flash before you. What I want to do is begin by asking you to help me tell the story of inequality. And that's this. I want us to calibrate our thinking, yours and my thinking, about inequality. So there are two things I want to ask you about to fill in the blanks on. So there's a first statement that talks about your priority as an individual, as a professional, your personal priority on what you want to see happen. So that's going to come at the end of that first statement. And then the second statement, it's a statement about what you think the rest of society should be thinking about. If you are going to be in a position of being an economist that tells other people how to interpret the world, if you are going to be in a position of getting economics training so that you are a public official, whether a political leader or a civil servant, to try and get society around you to do whatever it is you want them to do, you have to have a view about the second statement about other people. So I want you to fill in the blanks on those two statements using a choice from 4 different things. And these 4 different things have to do, they connect with our concern on inequality. The first thing is that your priority is to be able to become richer than you currently are. So that's a goal for you. The more general social statement is that you want the same for everyone. Everyone, no matter their socioeconomic background, should be able to become richer than they are currently. In other words, if you grew up in a public housing project, your parents are not educated, you did not go to the best schools, no matter your socioeconomic background, you ought to have space in the future in the society that you live in to become richer than you currently are. So first is a priority that personalizes to you. The second is a statement about what you want for the rest of society around you. And then I want you to fill in the blank, the end of each of these statements, with possibly become richer than you currently are. The second possibility is that you can become richer than your parents at the peak of their income earning potential. And you recognize that if you become richer than your parents, that is often the way in which we craft the idea of social mobility in an intergenerational sense. When Raj Chetty or Michael Kramer or other people run regressions of your income on your parents' income, and they ask for the regression coefficient, it's a statement about whether you can potentially become richer than your parents. So a second possibility that gets us to thinking about social mobility in an intergenerational sense. The first possibility is just a statement about your acquisition of skills and income earning potential, whether you will become richer than you currently are. Third possibility, that you get to an income percentile in society higher than you are currently. In other words, if you're thinking about someone who's at the bottom 25th percentile in society, they're among the 1/4 poorest in society, do they have the possibility of, in the future, rising to higher than the 25th percentile? Can they rise to the 90th percentile? Can they rise to the top 1%? That too is a statement about mobility, but you'll notice that this statement, the statement about your position, your rank in society and is changing, is different from a statement about becoming richer than your parents. But both of these, both 2 and 3, have been used as ways to quantify mobility in society. Finally, number 4, looking at the potential to live in a society where the gap between the richest and the poorest gets smaller than it currently is. So today, there's a certain amount of inequality in society, the gap between the rich and the poor. Do you want yourself, do you want everyone around you to live in a situation where in the future, that gap between the richest and the poorest gets smaller, converges? Now, all 4 of these are things that I think we can all sign up to in some degree. I would like to be richer than I currently am, even though I'm close to the end of my life. I would like to be richer than my parents. I grew up in a small town called Penang. My parents weren't very educated. Their economic potential was not high. They knew a very small circle of people. So, okay, that's achievable. I can become richer than my parents. Will I get to an income percentile in society higher than I am currently? Well, that's a question that I want to ask, not just of myself, but of society. Does society around me have institutions that create the space so that everyone in society feels that they can become better off? And better off in different senses. Senses of becoming richer than you currently are, richer than your parents, rising in the income distribution, or living in a society where the disparity between rich and poor gets smaller, it doesn't get larger. All 4 of these are different ways in which we might conceptualize a goal for income inequality, social mobility, and social cohesion in society. There are different ways in which we might envision, operationalize how we think about that. I just want to make a quick point here. Some of these desiderata that I put down are self-defeating. Yes, you can become richer than you currently are. You can become richer than your parents. But if you are constantly thinking about rising to a higher rank in society than you currently are, that imposes the negative externality that someone has to fall to a lower rank in society. And so that cycle never ends. So we can have conceptions of what it means to live in a good society, to live well in a good society with mobility, falling income inequality, but we have to recognize there are certain logical constraints to the things that we want. If you want social mobility in the sense of people rising in the ranks of society, you have to recognize that you can only rise in society if someone else falls. Right? That's different from your income rising higher. If you're comparing yourself constantly with others, there's a zero-sum nature to what you want in social mobility. So this idea that there are logical constraints on the things that we want of society is what drives what I'm going to tell you. There are three things that I'm going to try and go through in the time that I've got with you that try to drive towards the final conclusion that inequality is no sufficient statistic. First, I want to expand on this calibration you and I have just gone through in our minds about what it means to live in a good society with the good things that happen, that there is social churning, I get to rise higher in my incomes, that I might rise higher in the ranking of society. I'm going to rise, all of us see space so that we can rise to something above what our parents were so that there continues to be progress. Or we want to live in a society where inequality is falling. But I want to expand on this, what you and I have just gone through in our minds, because other people have also thought about these issues, obviously. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about inequality concerns. I want to take that and then describe for you one large empirical fact that comes from my rather selective choice of the set of inequality concerns. But I want to argue that the choice I'm making is one that's true to the spirit of this calibration exercise that we just came through. I'm going to suggest that that large empirical fact puts severe constraints on what we can expect for social policy in the income inequality space. Then I'm going to try and think about ways forwards from that, despite the severe constraints. So let's look at inequality concerns. When we say that inequality connects with the breakdown of social cohesion, there are actually numbers that attempt to, that there's empirical evidence that attempts to put flesh on that. This is a graph that shows a time series of strikes and demonstrations globally. So the dark line with the triangles is a time series representation of a count of peaceful strikes and demonstrations in societies for the last 20 to 25 years. You can extend this further back, but this is illustrative of what I want to, this illustrates what I want to try and get through. The first graph, the dark line, is basically flat for most of our history since 1995. There were strikes and demonstrations that went on. In 2010, the Arab Spring happened. The color revolutions propagated around the world. Arab Spring had to do with many, many different things: political control, democracy, freedoms. But when 2011, 2010 happened, Tunisia and the Arab Spring, and then that propagated to the rest of the world, this level of strikes and demonstrations that we see around the world skyrocketed and has remained high. There's a lot of manifestation of angry people out there. And it's not that the world has become a more violent place. Okay, look, abstract from Russia's terrible invasion of Ukraine, abstract from the the geopolitical difficulties that we're in. But for the recent history, up until the last couple of years, the incidence of armed conflict did not rise dramatically. It was, it bounced around. It increased after the mid-2000s, but then it did not skyrocket the same way that peaceful strikes and demonstrations did. Now, when we look at this, and then we try and figure out, well, what else is going on around the world? In the last couple of years, the geopolitical conversation has been about the United States, China. It's been about what John F. Kennedy and Hannah Arendt called great last great twilight struggle of humanity between democracy and freedom and tyranny and totalitarianism. And yes, that does color the way in which you and I have these conversations now. But that was not something that figured in 2011. What figured then was the global perception that income inequality had risen. And a lot of people, a lot of observers will look at these kinds of facts saying, well, what this is due to is the rise in income inequality, the perception, the growing realization that income inequality everywhere in the world had risen. Thomas Piketty and co-workers demonstrate this through the calculation of the top 1%, how the share of income going to top 1% has risen dramatically, and other indicators of income inequality. This matters, that income inequality matters, doesn't show up just indirectly at that global scale in strikes and demonstrations. It also shows up as something called the Great Gatsby Curve, a piece of terminology that Alan Kruger described in a speech that he gave when he was chairman of Council of Economic Advisors in the United States, and that then Barack Obama and others picked up. The Great Gatsby Curve is the idea that income inequality has implications, negative implications for other characteristics that we measure that show good society. So here, the horizontal axis is a measure of income inequality, measured by Gini coefficient, not top 1% shares, Gini coefficients. And then on the vertical axis, it's a measure of social mobility, the inverse of social mobility. Is that regression coefficient I described to you, your parents' income, of your income on your parents' income. The higher you go on the vertical axis, the less social mobility that is, less transition, the more powerfully tied down to your parents' income are you, the higher you go on the vertical axis. And what Alan Kruger and Miles Korak and other people, Stephen Durloff, the World Bank, World Economic Forum, and many, many others have calculated is this positive slope relation between inequality and lower mobility. And the idea here is that as you move to the right-hand side of this picture, you have higher and higher inequality in society. And at the same time, the regularity is that you get lower and lower social mobility. So income inequality has a double whammy. In terms of those four considerations that I wanted you to look at, thinking about what you want for yourself, what you think others around you should want. It has a double whammy in the sense that income inequality being high already means you're failing in terms of disparities between the richest and poorest. But on top of that, you also have lowered social mobility. You are more powerfully tied down to the socioeconomic class than your parents. The Great Gatsby curve shows that income inequality is extremely pernicious. And if you don't want, so there are these statistics that I've just described to you. They and many others point to how income inequality is indeed a great evil in the world, relative to the calibrations that we began with, but also more generally. Social discord, lowered social mobility, pushback against globalization, range of issues. These concerns are not new. Well, they're kind of new if you think that in 2014, Pope Francis pronounced that inequality is the root of social evil, and that Barack Obama just a little bit before then talked about inequality as the greatest obstacle, the defining challenge of our time. But you can go all the way back to Confucius, who said, disturbing is not scarcity, but inequality. Confucius, looking at Chinese society around him, said, yes, we've got people who are very poor. They have scarce resources. But what really is disturbing to me as a social philosopher and as someone who instructs those who make policy is that inequality is the big issue. Disturbing is not scarcity, but inequality. Common prosperity today in Xi Jinping's China, both common prosperity within the population and common prosperity across countries, inequality are huge issues in China, just as they are in the United States and in the West. This is a global concern over inequality. And those concerns can be fleshed out. It's not just these reduced form correlations that we're describing, but there are mechanisms that writers have developed both technically in mathematical models, but also just verbally. So for instance, here's one of them. Globalization, trade, and technology have polarized society into an elite that are highly paid, secure jobs on one side, and on the other side, an increasing number of people who are poor and getting poorer, and a middle class that's squeezed. That growing inequality has resulted in the erosion of trust in society's institutions. Barack Obama and Robert Reich, from that era of policymaking in the United States, described vividly why income inequality leads to lowered social mobility, why the Great Gatsby curve operates in America. Because when inequality is higher, the rungs between the ladder of opportunity get further and further apart, and it's harder and harder for people to climb this. This unbalanced division of opportunity puts at risk both national prosperity and international understanding. It's already pushed back against globalization, and in the United States and in the hands of talented, populist, nationalist leaders, inequality within society can be directed to antagonism towards the other, those who are foreign. So this is it's a big issue. Inequality immiserizes the disadvantaged society. It drives social discord, produces political upheaval. Writers from Piketty to Acemoglu and many, many others produce language like this. Let's get to what I want to say. In this quick run through of what a literature, very large literature, both technical and social commentary describes, alarmingly high economic inequality has spilled over into politics and social discussion. Economic insecurity drives the violent conflicts in the Middle East, the Tunisia Arab Spring, the rise of fascist elements in European countries, and even in the United States, of course, economic marginalization between those in the Midwest and the cosmopolitan elites on the East Coast and West Coast have led to a strengthening of chauvinistic and supremacist identities. Inequality is just really bad news. So those are some of the economic concerns. So I want to tell you, of course, the opposite. I want to take a pause from this quick run through of what the literature out there says, of both technical and social commentary. And I want to suggest to you that there's something not quite right in that conversation, in that discussion. So I talk about the large empirical fact that I have documented for you. And the way I'm going to do that, there are different ways to read what I'm going to bring out, but one way to start thinking about it is this. This is a piece of phrasing from the Human Development Report of 2019. And it talks about inequality. Many people have little prospect for a better future. This idea that there's space in the future for them to either rise in the income distribution or achieve a higher rank in society, people are seeing that close. People see that space closed. And when they see that space closed, they lose hope. They realize that they will never escape poverty. They will never have the opportunities or the resources to control their own destiny. This is what I want to start building on. I'm going to introduce the empirical fact now and then use it to talk about some more general things. If we take this description as what we want to try and think about fine-tuning or dealing with economic inequality to repair, let's ask this question. What will repair the ills here? This description of the despair that large chunks of society are suffering conflates a number of narratives, two in particular. We want people to have the resources to control their lives. But we also think about inequality because we talk about these people as seeing others pulling ahead of them. So I'll boil down that question to what will repair this dismal situation that the Human Development Report accounts for us. Will reducing inequality do this? Well, it might, because there's the Miles-Correct, Alan Kruger, Great Gatsby curve. There's all the documentation and the theoretical models about why inequality leads to dysfunction in society. It might do that. From very early on, Tabellini and Alicina, Tabellini and Pearson and many others described how when you have societies that are unequal, it's quite natural to set policies to try and repair them. Those policies are distortionary. And so these distortionary policies reduce the resources that are available for everyone. So reducing inequality might actually fix these problems. But it might also be there's a better, more direct way to do this. So maybe we just want to help those who don't have the resources to control their destiny. Give those people access to resources to control their destiny. Now, the question that sits before us is, how does inequality set up a tension with providing people the resources to control their destiny? I can think of circumstances under which that would happen. If the world were a zero-sum game, and there was only a fixed amount of resources in the world, then higher inequality does mean poorer people have access to fewer resources. However, if the world is not a zero-sum game, then that link between inequality and poorer people, the weak and vulnerable, having the resources to help themselves, that link is broken. This is an empirical question. Is the world close enough to a zero-sum game in talking about social discord, economic opportunity, giving the weak and vulnerable the resources to help themselves? Is the world close enough to a zero-sum game that ties income inequality to that circle of problems? If it is, then yes, income inequality is a sufficient statistic for us to understand these social challenges. But if it isn't, then we have freed income inequality to do other things, and we might want to focus on the real social challenges before us. What I'm going to get to is an empirical fact that says we do, in fact, liberate income inequality, but we don't liberate it in a totally random way. It's liberated, but it turns around to help us think about how we give poor people enough resources to help themselves, to give people enabled, meaningful, satisfying lives. So let me begin my one empirical fact, but let me begin by doing it in a very micro, distorted, personal way. This is a description of the story of Singapore. The blue line on the left-hand side graph is a description, is a calculation of income inequality. And let me be very clear. I'm describing income inequality here, not as a Gini coefficient, not as the share of the top 1% or share of any X%, but as the separation in income between rich and poor. And by that, I mean, by rich, I mean the top 10%, and by poor, I mean the bottom 50%. The reason I want to measure income inequality in this way is that it is then in units of income. And I can compare these units of income with other things that also come in units of income. So the blue line shows income inequality in Singapore. It began relatively small, but then from 1980 until 2020, it had risen to over 5 times what it used to be. One of the benefits of calculating income inequality this way is that I can say things like that, whereas saying that for the Gini coefficient makes no sense at all. Because you can't say, why would you be interested in a 6-fold increase in the Gini coefficient? It's bounded between 0 and 1, so that makes no sense. But measuring it in this way, it's always positive. It extends upwards as much as you wish. Income inequality has risen 6-fold in Singapore over the last 40 years. This red line there shows the average income of the bottom 50%. That's the weak and vulnerable. All the discussion that we were talking about previously about giving people access to resources so that they can live, enable meaningful, satisfying lives. When you apply that to the poor, that's described by this red line. Well, the world does look zero-sum, close enough. As inequality has risen, the poor, if not strictly immiserized, do not seem to be advancing. And because their average income has remained low in absolute terms, and as a proportion of the gap between the rich and the poor has gotten smaller and smaller. The second graph focuses on this red line, but then blows it up. It charts it by itself, taking away the dominating blue line. And what we see when I said earlier that the bottom 50% seem not to have benefited over these last 40 years is not correct. Because the average income of the bottom 50% in Singapore has risen 4 times over the last 40 years. A 4-fold increase in average income is nothing to turn your nose up at. People in the bottom 50% of Singapore society have become much better off. They've not become as well off as the rich, but then that information is already encoded in the inequality figures. So what does this say? This says, well, depending on how you look at it, the world is either close to a zero-sum game or it isn't. If you look at this picture, where you look at the comparison between income inequality, gap between rich and poor, and the very poor, it looks like the rich have made off with all the goodies, all the good things that have happened in Singapore's development, leaving the poor to have basically unchanged level of income. But if you focus on what's actually happened with the poor, you see they have had a 4-fold increase in their economic well-being. That's Singapore. Same thing for China. So China's inequality and not poverty, but inequality and income at the bottom of the income distribution, the bottom 50%, as opposed to the top 1%. In China, inequality fell as the last stages of Chinese socialism worked its way through the system. But then Deng Xiaoping, urbanization, opening up Chinese economy, marketization, urbanization took off, and China's income inequality rose dramatically. What happened to the very poor in China? Well, again, it looked like they kept low. But you and I also remember the World Bank had documented how China had lifted 650 million people out of poverty in the last quarter of a century. And here they are. So this is the average income of the bottom 50%. And what we see here is something quite different from the Singapore story. In Singapore, inequality rose, the poor looked like nothing was happening, but then we realized the poor were also advancing. In China, we see that occurring at the later part of the sample, but it's also not just logically possible, but empirically so, that the opposite could happen. Income inequality could fall, and the income of the bottom 50% also fell. Wait a minute, what's going on here? If these pictures do show that zero-sum game nature to things, then it looked like when inequality fell, it's not that the poor benefited, the poor also became poorer. This is not the difference between absolute poverty and relative poverty. This is not trying to draw a distinction between income inequality and poverty. It's a simple statement, much, much more direct and straightforward than those complicated ideas that in China, it so happened that when income inequality fell, the poor suffered over that same period of time. Then let me just do a third, and then I've tested your patience enough. This is the United States. The United States saw an increase in income inequality. Again, the bottom 50% seems like to do nothing, but this is actually what happened in the United States at the bottom 50%. The United States example is even trickier in that for the decade from 1980 until 2000, depending on how you cut those windows, America's inequality rose, but the bottom 50% not just remained stagnant, their absolute level of income actually fell. America did see that immiserisation. We have 3 different experiences between income inequality and poverty. I could do this for the remaining 198 nations, but we will all have left the room before I get to the end of that. Let me cut to the chase. This is what happened in the 200 nations. So let me pause for a minute and then take us through this picture. This is a picture that attempts to scrunch the information that I gave you previously in each of those three graphs into a single data point. Here's Singapore. Here's the United States. Way up there is China. Those were three of the nations that I showed you earlier. What this picture shows is on the horizontal axis, the number of times that average income at the bottom 50% changed by. So a number that's to the right of one says that the bottom 50%, the weak and vulnerable in society, saw the average income increase. There are observations to the left of one, which said that immiserisation occurred. There were some nations where over time, over these last several decades, the bottom 50% actually saw their incomes in absolute terms, not relative terms, in absolute terms fall. The vertical axis, I've just told you about the horizontal axis, the vertical axis is the number of times measure of inequality changed over this period. So a number like China, way up there, oops, sorry. Now I know what this extra button does. Okay, so China is way up there. Remember, China was the one that saw inequality increase dramatically. So it is way up on the vertical side of this picture. But it's also way to the right of this picture, which showed the improvement in the incomes of the bottom 50%. Singapore is like roughly in the middle. America is on this side, which on the one hand conforms with what I said about the bottom 50% not doing particularly well. But despite all the other things that we hear about America, its change in income inequality is not extraordinary. It's above one, so income inequality did rise over time, but it's not extraordinary compared to the population of other nations. Every dot in this picture is a nation over the last 4 decades. When you ask yourself, the collection of dots here, what's the regularity? The best fitting non-parametric estimated line drawn across these 200 or so economies is upward sloping and relatively tightly estimated. The standard errors are not huge around that upward sloping line. Pause a moment and think about what that says. It says that across the sample of 200 national experiences, when you see an improvement in the economic well-being of the weak and vulnerable, that comes hand in hand with an increase in inequality. Income inequality seems to come together with an improvement in the well-being of the very poor. This is not an arithmetic necessity. These dots are free to go wherever they will in this picture. This is an empirical regularity that shows different national experiences. The fit is relatively tight and it's positive. Those nations that have seen the worst performance in improving the plight of the weak and vulnerable are also nations where income inequality has either fallen or not increased by a lot. Income inequality is no sufficient statistic of how well the poor are doing. But more than just that, income inequality is not random relative to national experiences. Income inequality seems to come hand in hand with improvement in the well-being of the weak and vulnerable. There's a story here that I want to get to, but this positive correlation says that if I am concerned about the weak and vulnerable in my society, the way that everybody I cited previously seemed to be, this picture seems to contradict the way in which they view the effect of income inequality. Because the way they view the effect of income inequality is one that says we've got to get income inequality under control. If possible, we need to lower it because it is that will help the poor. That view is one that conforms to a zero-sum nature to the world, zero-sum nature to the workings of economies. This empirical regularity contradicts that view. And it contradicts that view not in a random kind of way that there's no relation. It contradicts that view in a flip of the sign. It says that if you think the sign ought to be negative, it's actually positive. So the fact that income inequality is no sufficient statistic does not mean that it is not a useful statistic, but it's a useful statistic that goes in the opposite direction. There's some other things to say about this. One is, if we try and play with that idea, one way to think about this is that this is a supply curve. What is the good, let me get you in 30 seconds. What is the good thing that we want for society? What is it we're trying to buy for society? I don't know about you, but I want the weak and vulnerable in society to become better off. I want to move my society rightwards in this picture. The price that I have to pay for that, if this empirical regularity is ironclad, no guarantee there is, but if it is, I'm going to have to pay a price in terms of income inequality. Income inequality is the price with which I buy improvement in the well-being of the weak and vulnerable. It is a supply curve where the price is income inequality and the quantity that I'm buying is an improvement in the well-being of the weak and vulnerable in my society. Let me pause, guys. I see questions. You were very patient. Thank you for waiting. Please.
Just wondered, so do you not think that these two relationships are confounded by many other factors, as well as being subject to many other technological
Excellent point. The reason that I think all these matter, but they're not overwhelming, is the tight fit that I get from a single variable regression. If all of these things mattered, and you think that they're varying across nations, the X prime X matrix is full rank, then they would confound this tight relation between the two. Not only is this tight relation tight, but that you can say further. You can say further that the relation between the bottom 50% average income change and the change in income inequality is one where a high percentage, every time you see inequality rise, so too does the well-being of the poor rise. Every time you see the well-being of the poor rise, so too you see a high percentage of income inequality rising. If the X prime X matrix were full rank and all these other things mattered, then you would not find this kind of a tight relationship. I mean, unless everything else lined up the same way, but then it'd be very coincidence. So I want to try and do more work on establishing that, but my first pass through the data says that this relationship is one that has a certain standing, but still to be investigated. Thank you for your question. Brian.
Hi, Danny. Thank you so much. So one point you raised just then concerns essentially whether or not the economy is zero sum, negative sum, and positive sum, right? So essentially in instances where it's a positive sum, then the difference principle essentially applies to the Rorschach plane here. Now, I was just wondering, we would decompose these countries into different types of categories of positive sum, negative sum, and zero sum economies. Presumably, the causal claim that inequality leads to worsening effects due to positionality or other sorts of sociological effects on the worst of, that would apply in negative sum societies, right? And maybe possibly in zero sum societies. So it's really just an institutional categorical question.
Yeah, no, that's a good angle. Yeah, Brian, let me pause you right there. That's a good angle. But I want to pause you right there because I don't think going down that route is going to be very fruitful. What this picture indicates is that the world is a positive sum game. Right? Because that the world is a positive sum game is what gives rise to this positive slope. That you have high inequality, the rich becoming very, very well off, but at the same time, the poor also being so. Similarly, on this side, the fact that there are these two extremes actually tell us the world is positive sum. So I wanted to pause you right there, Brian, because it's useful to think about all those other possibilities. But my hunch is based on this, the world is a positive sum game. Yes.
New question. Where is the progressive taxation system and all kinds of policies?
Yeah. Now these are, okay, so these are the same data as Thomas Piketty uses, and that's available in his database. So I don't remember where progressive taxation and other things show up in that collection of data. However, if these same data are being used to pronounce on how terrible income inequality has become from the top 1%, whatever is true there is also true here. So let me go back and check on that. But my hunch is that for some of these economies, they include those calculations, some of them don't. Yeah, please, Sam.
Yeah, is this picture basically a development story where you have mainly fast developing countries at the top right, and you have older developed economies at the bottom or perhaps in the middle, Norway. And it's a kind of Cosmets curve story, is it?
It is kind of.
As
It is.
countries
Yeah.
industrialize,
Yeah.
so inequality increases. But what you add to the story is this rather nice aspect about the bottom.
Yeah, you're right. And I want to build on what you just said, but I also want to be careful to try and think through some. What you described is suggestive of there being two kinds of effects: developing country type effects and developed country effects. What I've got here is a single model that fits the two of them in a tight positively sloped curve. So the distinction between developed countries and developing countries helps give me insight onto where on this graph they locate. However, they don't change the slope of the graph. The slope of the graph remains what it is. But your point makes me think about another thing I want to get to, if I may. I've just given us an interpretation of this as a supply curve. Listen, I am a dyed-in-the-wool economist. I might do international relations now, but I think about things in terms of demand and supply. And when I look at this picture, I think, oh, it's a supply curve. Let me come back to this. So here's this picture. So I think I gave you an interpretation of this curve being a supply curve for inequality. And I just told you a story about how different nations, because of their preferences, because of the demand side, choose different locations on that supply curve. But the identification of that supply curve is one where there are, using the usual simultaneous equations, econometrics idea, the supply curve is not shocked, but the demand curves are. And the demand curves are shocked because national preferences are different for how much they want to take care of the weak and vulnerable in their society. When that demand curve is shocked and it moves around, it traces out the supply curve. In that interpretation, inequality is the price that societies are willing to pay to take care of the weak and vulnerable in their society. This is quite a different kind of thinking than inequality is a sufficient statistic, we must fix it. This says that inequality is an endogenous outcome that societies have made an explicit choice on. Now, this seems to be really peculiar, but it's actually the same story as a long-established idea. I put up here Arthur Oken's book on equality and efficiency, The Big Trade-off, which I don't know if people still read that. I know that when this was assigned in my introductory economics course decades ago, I didn't read it. At Princeton University, where I was an undergraduate, you studied technical economics during the semester. You did the Slutsky effects and you calculated all kinds of elasticities with numbers and things. And then at reading period, just before the exam, the professor might have felt guilty about just spending all this time on technical things and gave you something that was broad and big picture to read. In my year, what Ellen Blinder did for us in my reading period was assign this book. I looked at this book and there were no equations in it, but I decided not to read. But what this book does, I've gone back and had to go to graduate school, so I better read that, needed a letter reference from Ellen. So I went and read this book. And what it talks about is that there's income inequality, that societies can make a choice to try and repair. And when they repair it, what they do is they try and move income from the very rich to the poor, to help the weak and vulnerable in society. That's an explicit choice that they make. But, and this is Arthur Oaken's vivid visualization, think about redistribution as being done with a leaky bucket. Arthur Oaken's leaky bucket. The more redistribution you want to do, the more you have to take that leaky bucket into the trough of the rich and bring it to the poor. But the more you do that, the more there's loss to society, the more society loses. So redistribution comes with a loss in efficiency. Now, that actually turns out gives mathematically the same formulation that inequality is an endogenous variable that societies are willing to pay to take care of their weak and vulnerable. And the slope of the inequality curve that is traced out in either of these stories turns out to be the same. It's a positive schedule. Okay, let me finish. I've tested your patience, and I did want to have questions. Did want people to have questions. I'm running over a bit. Let me just finish, because part of the promise in this is, if the facts are as clear as I think they are, why do we still think the opposite? Why do so many of us think inequality is what we need to repair? I'm just going to show you 3 pictures, and then that's the end. One way is that, look, the first step to combat inequality is to understand it. Think piece. Promoting the study of economics enables citizens to understand why we can promote better performing societies. Tackling inequality is a political choice. All wonderful things to describe. Look at these 2 pictures. Where do you see inequality in these pictures? No, these are pictures only of poverty. We, in this story, were hit with the message that says inequality, that's like poverty. You want to combat inequality? Yes, let's do that. But the terrible things about inequality is it produces poor people. Inequality and poverty are the same thing. Fail. This is not, I know that none of you would fail this because you were asked this question on your Oxford interviews. I've been told. And we are very clear about the distinction between inequality and poverty. Let me show you a second example. And this is a string of them. Oxfam. India ranks bottom of Oxfam World Inequality Index. Look at the pictures that Oxfam shows. Poor people in a rubbish heap, poor slums, inequality, poverty, the same thing. Look at this story from the United States. US income inequality, highest level in 50 years. Yes, we saw that. Possible immiserisation of the poor. Yes, we saw that. Where do you see inequality in that picture? It's only a picture of poor people. Fail. Let me finish with, every part of the world does it bad. Let me show you an example from where I live. Singapore. Singapore, over the course of the pandemic, showed in its Straits Times, the newspaper where my wife works, incidentally. So I'm not sort of playing favorites. It showed 2 societies. I mean, it shows 2 parts of society. And yes, now we've got inequality. Look, there's rich people, middle income class, over the course of the pandemic, doing home-based learning, airy space, everything sunny, bright, everyone has a fancy new computer. The parents are professionals who get to stay at home, help their children with home-based learning, as opposed to this side, which is a picture of poor people in Singapore. They don't even have desks. They've got makeshift apparatus that they've put computers that have been loaned from the Ministry of Education on. Stark difference between rich and poor. So over the course of the pandemic, the experience between the rich and poor have been different. All that is spot on. That's correct. So kudos to them. They actually picked up on this difference between rich and poor. However, it also talks about how the digital divide between the haves and have-nots have worsened the experience of the poor over the pandemic. Sorry, that's my time up. But over the course of the pandemic, the experience of rich and poor have been different. But the stories that have run in Singapore and elsewhere is that the experience of the poor have been exacerbated because of income inequality. And this is a different layer of complication. It's no longer the conflation between inequality and poverty. What it says is that these people have suffered worse than they should have because of the existence of these people, because the existence of income inequality. I submit to you that that's, as a proposition, that's illogical. The experience of the poor over the course of the pandemic is going to be the same, a miserable experience, whether or not there were rich people living the next street over. Unless there is envy, unless there is the idea that that people are looking at this measure of social cohesion and then making them miserable. If you are poor and you don't have desks and computers to work on, your experience is going to be miserable because you are poor and you don't have desks and computers to work on, not because there are rich people the next street over. So that ends my presentation. I've told you about the concerns that drive my work. I've told you about the one empirical fact, and that's just one. It's not 75 pages of tables with a 200-page appendix. It's just one calculation that shows the supply curve for income inequality. And then I've told you about why it is that despite this strength of this evidence, we still think that income inequality has been such a terrible thing in society. I mean, all else equal, I might not want to live in a highly unequal society, but that's quite different from saying that people are miserable in an unequal society. And the way that I think the way ahead in my own research is the media. I am systematically documenting beyond these three examples why it is or how it is that the media have projected a picture to society that continues to conflate poverty and inequality, so that we are all now left with despite when you came into Oxford, the students among you, and you were interviewed about the difference between poverty and inequality, it was crystal clear in your mind. But over the course of the next 20 years of your life, you're going to be hit with a barrage of media, traditional and social, that continues to conflate inequality and poverty, and technical writings in economics that continue to point to inequality as the cause for all of these world's challenges. And I want to suggest to you that that's actually not a good place to be. But thank you all very much.
Okay, so we had a bit of a Q&A during it. We are a few minutes over, but there was at least one question online that I will put you, and then if there's a few others in the room, I'll take a few and let Danny answer them before we wrap up. And importantly, just remember, when we wrap up, there will be a drinks reception next door. So, bear that in mind when thinking how long your questions are going to be. So the question online came from Rowena. I'm going to sort of paraphrase it a little bit. It's a question about how we define richness in a society. Is it always based on dollars worth?
That's an excellent question. I don't think it should be, but I've calculated it's based on dollars because one, it is the index that everybody else uses. When people talk about income, when people talk about inequality, the top 1%, it is dollars that we're using. My point applies whether or not you're thinking about dollars or you're thinking about the resources by which people can control their own destiny. When you're thinking about the gap between rich and poor, you can be thinking about socioeconomic classes. To the extent that there are indicators that show all of these different variants, we know that they're highly correlated with income. They're not perfectly correlated, they're highly correlated with income. And the same message that I'm telling you now with a precision from income would carry over onto these richer descriptions.
Any other questions in the room?
Okay, this is the second one. Can I have it?
There's no other hand up, so you get the last question.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, with two.
So I can find the objective story, but there's a subjective story.
Yes.
You use the word envy. Now, might it not be the case that your relative deprivation comes into play? A sociologist would tell us, and people's orbits of coercive comparison come into play, and they come into play in part because of social media. This is what is driving the link between inequality and social discontent.
Yeah, I believe you. I believe that that's a hugely important factor. There is, wait, if I may, let me show one thing. In Urdu and Arabic, there's a difference between hasad and rushd and litta, which are different words that describe envy. What you're describing here is the sociological manifestation of envy. Hasad in both Urdu and Arabic refers to a kind of envy that is one that says, I am jealous and I wish the rich people didn't have things that they do. Rushd and Lipta, on the other hand, in both Urdu and Arabic, also describe envy, but they describe envy in the following sense. You are much richer than me. May the blessings of Allah bring to me the same things that you have. There's an envy that's aspirational and positive, and there's an envy that's negative. And I think that, I'm all for sociological interrogation of the kinds of things here. But we need to also say, not say that there's just one kind of sociological investigation. We need to be open to how society has decided that Hassad is the way to go, rather than Rushd and Lipta. If I may, let me end with one quick anecdote. Gore Vidal, great American author, wonderful achievements. He used to say that every time a friend of mine has their book appear on the New York Times bestseller list, the little part of me inside dies. Envy is real, no question. But my final observation is, do we want to base public policy on feeding the envy in humanity? And I would suggest that if we get on that, that's a dangerous journey.
One last one, Shiha.
I thought that was an interesting comment about whether we should base public policy on envy, but maybe envy is a fact of society, and it's not that we can choose to ignore it, but the fact that if there is a lot of envy in society, it causes more fractured society, and it's the condition we have to take into account of policy. I don't know whether you kind of. Yeah,
I'm afraid I'm going to have to disagree with that. And some of the worst things that happened in the history of humanity, the Hitler's convictions about certain races in society, arguably Russia's convictions about Ukraine being part of Russia. Those are not tendencies we should give into. We should do everything we can to work against those beliefs and preferences in society that are harmful. So I don't think we should give in to envy, to using envy as a way to conduct public policy. This is, of course, I'm allowed to say that as an academic, how exactly in public policy we do that. But, education, the media needs to be more responsible. The ways in which we have discourse and conversation need to elevate to a higher level. I don't think we should fall to the lowest common denominator in society. We should aspire to something better.
Right. So before I let you all go, there's a few thank yous that I'd like to do. So we would certainly not be here. The Hicks lectures are supported by the Oxford Economics Papers. And so I'm going to embarrass both James Porter and Francis Teal, who are the managing editors, and thank them for not just today and the history of the Hicks lectures, but also the OEP is a wonderful supporter of the department and a lot of the graduate students. So on behalf of everybody in the department, to them and all the other. Got to thank Emma Heritage, and I saw Rose Page just snuck out the back because she is still organizing, even though the talk is nearly done. But without them, quite literally, many of us would not be here physically. So thank you to both of them. Thank everybody who joined online, in the room, and most of all, I won't get you to clap for yourselves, but most of all, for the last time, let me just get you to thank again a wonderful, thought-provoking, as always. Thank you very much for coming and delivering this lecture, Professor Danny Quah.